21-year-old Annie Braddock has recently graduated from Montclair State University. She has no idea what or who she wants to be. One day, while sitting in the park, Annie sees a young boy about to be hit by a Segway. Annie saves him and meets the boy's mother, who we meet as Mrs. X. When she introduces herself as Annie, Mrs. X mistakes her words for Nanny and hires her to look after Grayer, the boy she saved. Mrs. X also continues to call her Nanny instead of Annie throughout the film. Annie lies to her mother Judy about taking a job at a bank and, in reality, moves into the XS apartment to be the nanny for Grayer. Life with the incredibly privileged XS is not what she thought it would be, and her life is complicated further when she falls for Harvard hottie, who also lives in the building. Interspersed with her life as the XS nanny are her interactions with Harvard hottie, as well as her longtime friend Lynette. Harvard hottie reveals to Annie that he can relate to her charge Grayer, as when he lost his mother age for his absentee father left him with a string of nannies until he reached the age he could be shipped off to boarding school. Annie continues to keep her mother in the dark about her real job, giving her regular but false progress reports. Further complications arise when Judy decides to visit her, forcing Annie to pretend Lynette and her roommate Calvin are a couple and that their apartment is Annie's apartment. Judy ultimately discovers the truth when Grayer becomes severely ill, and Annie desperately calls her for help. After a rough start, Annie eventually bonds with Grayer, whom she addresses by his preferred code name, Grover, and discovers that he is actually a sweet and loving child who is neglected by both his parents, which explains his uncontrollable behavior. Parallel to this, Annie begins to also notice that Grayer is not the only one being neglected. Mrs. X is as well, with Mr. X constantly being cruel to her and committing subtly obvious adultery. Mrs. X makes numerous attempts to make her husband love her, including lying to him about being pregnant with their second child. Annie soon realizes that Mrs. X's own cruel treatment of her is due to Mrs. X's growing frustrations from her dysfunctional marriage. Things take a turn for the worse during a family trip with the X's to Nantucket. She overhears Mrs. X telling a friend during a party that she has installed a nanny cam at their home in the city and plans to fire Annie after viewing footage showing Annie lovingly tending to Grayer, with Mrs. X grossly exaggerating her findings from the nanny cam. The next morning, Mr. X sexually assaults Annie just as Mrs. X enters the kitchen. She unreasonably fires Annie and sends her back to the city with her final payment of just $40. Flying into a rage, Annie finds the nanny cam in the X's house and records her feelings toward the XS. Mrs. X brings the tape to the school meeting for the Upper East Side mothers. Thinking that the tape will show Annie feeding Grayer peanut butter and jelly straight from a jar, she requests the coordinator to play it for everyone to see. All other parents in the room hear as Annie reveals the real relationship between the XS, in the process making Mrs. X come to terms with her own reality and false happiness. Annie reconciles with her mother and continues to date Harvard hottie, whose real name is revealed to be Hayden. She is temporarily living with Lynette and Calvin and pursuing her growing interest in anthropology, much of which she learned through her time as the XS nanny. A few months later, Hayden hands Annie a letter from Mrs. X. Written in the letter is an apology and news about how Mrs. X left Mr. X, is raising Grayer alone and making stronger attempts to bond with him, and successfully doing so. In Grayer's overall improvement, she expresses her gratitude to Annie for waking her up and changing her life. Also in the letter, Mrs. X addresses Annie for the first time by her real name, instead of Nanny, and signs the letter with her own first name, Alexandra, instead of Mrs. X. Thank you for watching this video. Do well to hit the subscribe and like button for more movie recaps. Thank you, and bye for now.